Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than evil. This is not a rhetorical line. It is a truth born of observation. Evil can be exposed. Evil wears a face. It declares its intentions, and when confronted with truth, it often retreats. Ashamed, or at least aware. But stupidity has no such conscience. It has no shame, because it does not know itself. I have come to believe, after long reflection, that stupidity is not a lack of intelligence. It is not the domain of the uneducated or the simple. No, it is a moral collapse, a deliberate surrender of the responsibility to think. A person may be clever, articulate, even widely read, and yet utterly stupid in the most dangerous sense. For stupidity, in its most insidious form, is not an intellectual defect. It is a moral one. It arises when people, in fear or comfort, in laziness or loyalty, choose to abandon judgment and let someone else think on their behalf. This kind of stupidity is not passive. It is active. It defends its illusions with violence. It mocks reason. It ridicules truth. It shouts because it has nothing to say. We are witnessing its rise. Not in a battlefield, not in a political doctrine alone, but in the subtle, daily surrender of thought. In how easily people now believe what is convenient. How quickly they speak what is expected. How rarely they pause to ask, is this true? Is this right? Have I thought it through? And when stupidity becomes widespread, when whole populations begin to abandon their conscience to crowds, to ideologies, to influencers and leaders, they are no longer reasoning individuals. They are noise. This is when power becomes stupid. Not because the ones in control are unintelligent, but because the people have made it possible for empty authority to be worshipped, for slogans to replace ethics, and for obedience to replace responsibility. You cannot reason with stupidity. You cannot persuade it with facts, or enlighten it with education. For stupidity has nothing to do with truth, and everything to do with the refusal to engage with it. In this way, it is more dangerous than the lie, because the lie still knows it is false. Stupidity believes itself righteous. In such times, we must not ask only, who is in power? We must ask, what kind of power have we made possible? This is the rise of stupid powering the power of masses who do not think. The power of silence when truth should be spoken. The power of reaction without understanding. But we are not helpless. The resistance does not begin with weapons or with noise. It begins quietly. It begins wherever one person chooses to think, to question, to stand still amid the panic and ask, is this good? Is this true? I write not as a philosopher of theory, but as one who has seen how societies unravel, not because of violent tyrants, but because of the passive millions who made them possible. Do not think that silence is neutral. It is not. In the face of stupidity, silence becomes complicity. So I ask you, in this moment of rising confusion and false confidence, will you think, or will you follow? Will you reason, or will you repeat? Will you remain humang, or become useful to stupidity? The answer, now as ever, will decide the future. You must understand, stupidity does not announce itself. It does not arrive with banners or proclamations. It seeps in, quietly, invisibly, until it is everywhere. And by then, it is almost impossible to dislodge. The man who no longer thinks for himself does not become a monster overnight. No. He becomes something more dangerous. He becomes available to be used, to be told, to be guided by those who have the will to rule and the tools to deceive. This is how stupidity grows in the soil of obedience. Not obedience to moral law or to divine truth, but obedience to structure, to systems, to voices that relieve the burden of choice. People do not usually choose stupidity out of wickedness. They arrive there because it feels easier. Thinking is hard. Judging is lonely. Standing alone is frightening, and so, many do not stand at all. They merge into the crowd. They say what the others say. They nod when it is safer to nod. And they stop asking questions. Because questions threaten the delicate peace of their conformity. I have seen this myself. Not only in the rise of false leaders, but in the disappearance of true individuals. People whom I once knew as thoughtful, reflective, even critical, began to speak in pre-assembled sentences. Their convictions were no longer their own. They were borrowed, packaged, and repeated. The light of discernment had dimmed. In its place, slogans, gestures, imitation, obedience had replaced understanding. And do not think this is limited to politics or ideology. It happens in families, in churches, in communities. Wherever a person says, "I must not ask," stupidity takes root. Wherever a person says, "I must not speak," stupidity gains ground. It becomes the air they breathe. But here is the danger: once enough people choose silence, truth begins to sound like rebellion. Integrity becomes a threat. Reason becomes a nuisance. And those who dare to think become outcasts in a world that no longer remembers how. This is what I mean when I speak of the death of reason. We are not merely watching people make foolish decisions. We are watching entire cultures abandon their birthright to reason, to discern, to speak with conscience. And when that happens, authority is no longer earned. It is assigned. Power is no longer questioned. It is absorbed. The silent majority does not resist evil, it enables it, by refusing to see it. There will always be clever men who rise to exploit this. That is predictable. But they are not the source of our collapse. The true cause is deeper. It is the quiet consent of those who prefer comfort over clarity. Those who kneel before safety and excuse the decay of thought in the name of peace. This is the silent obedience I fear most. And so I urge you again. Not with anger, but with sorrow, do not become useful to stupid power. Do not surrender your mind for the illusion of belonging. Think, even if it isolates you. Speak, even if it costs you. For it is not noise that saves us. It is truth spoken in silence. The future depends not on those who command, but on those who refuse to follow blindly. There is a subtle violence that is often missed. It does not come through weapons or threats. It comes through words. I do not speak here of poetry or philosophy, but of propaganda. The deliberate distortion of thought for the purpose of control. The rise of stupid power is always accompanied by a flood of carefully chosen language. And its goal is simply to replace reasoning with reaction. In an age ruled by propaganda, truth is no longer sought. It is manufactured. Repetition becomes authority. Emotion replaces argument. A phrase, shouted often enough, is accepted as fact. not because it is true, but because it is familiar. Propaganda does not need your belief. It only needs your obedience. It does not try to persuade. It overwhelms. It plays upon fear, pride, and insecurity. It flatters your prejudices and numbs your conscience. It makes you feel safe inside your agreement and isolated if you ask questions. It is here that reason begins to die. The thinker becomes the threat. The doubter becomes the traitor. And those who hold fast to discernment are told they are divisive, disloyal, or dangerous. In this way, propaganda not only spreads falsehood, it punishes thought. What is most frightening is how quickly people will defend what they do not understand. They will fight to protect the very slogans that enslave them, not because they are evil, but because they no longer know how to think apart from what they've been told. This is the spiritual crisis of our time. Not that people believe lies, but that they are no longer interested in whether something is true. A people deprived of truth becomes a people who are easily ruled. And yet the tragedy is not only in the rule, it is in the consent. I have long believed that the task of the individual, especially in dark times, is not to shout with the masses, but to listen for what has been silenced, to question what has become unquestionable, to pause where others rush, to think where others obey. But to do this requires courage. It requires a kind of solitude of the soul, for propaganda isolates the thinker and rewards the follower. It builds systems where doubt is dangerous and obedience is virtuous. And so we must asking, what do I repeat without reflection? What phrases have replaced my thinking? Whose words live in my mouth before I have tested them in my mind? We must resist not with noise, but with clarity, not with certainty, but with conscience. We must learn again how to ask, is it true? Not is it popular? Not will I be accepted if I believe it? But, is it right, even if I am alone in saying so? For reason is not a luxury. It is not a privilege of the few. It is the final defense of freedom. And where reason is mocked, silenced, or dismissed, there, stupid power reigns. So I tell you again, watch the language that governs your world. If it cannot bear scrutiny, if it cannot endure questions, if it demands agreement before thought, then it is not truth. It is control. And your refusal to think is what gives it life. If we are to speak honestly about resistance, we must first strip away the illusions of what resistance looks like. It is not always protest. It is not always rebellion in the streets or defiance in public halls. No. The truest resistance often begins where no one sees it, within the mind of a solitary person who refuses to stop thinking. This is the battlefield where all tyrannies are first confronted. Not in government, not in revolution, but in conscience. A person who still thinks is dangerous to every system that depends on blind obedience. You see, the architects of stupid power do not fear those who shout. They can be silenced. They can be absorbed into the machinery of reaction. But they do fear the quiet individual who asks, is this true? They fear the one who reflects before repeating, who reads before responding, who chooses silence, not because they are afraid, but because they are observing what others overlook. This kind of presence cannot be manipulated. It cannot be bought with approval or silenced with shame. In a world that is increasingly loud, distracted, and emotionally hijacked, the rarest and most subversive act is stillness and thought. For when a person begins to think clearly, they also begin to see clearly. They see that slogans are often shields for emptiness, that popular beliefs are not always moral, that the crowd is not always right, and often not even thinking. This clarity is the seed of resistance. Not resistance against people, but resistance against dehumanization. Because the loss of thought is not merely an intellectual failure. It is the beginning of moral extinction. A person who stops thinking eventually stops caring. And a society that's thinking eventually stops recognizing evil. To resist, then, is to reclaim your own mind. It is to refuse to let culture do your reasoning, to let power dictate your values, to let fear decide your voice. And let me be clear, this is not without cost. To think in an age of mass stupidity is to feel out of place. To hold a question when others demand certainty is to risk isolation. But this isolation is not a curse. It is your proof that your conscience is still alive. We must be willing to endure this exile of thought. For it is only in this space that genuine resistance grows. And it is only this kind of resistance that has ever changed the world. For every great movement toward justice, toward dignity, toward truth, began with someone who chose to think when it would have been easier to follow. So I ask you, not as an idealist, but as one who has lived under the crushing weight of thoughtless power, will you remain in agreement just to be safe? Or will you risk the loneliness of thinking in order to be free? The future does not belong to the loudest voices. It belongs to those who refuse to hand over their minds to the machinery of stupidity. Resist, not with hatred, but with clarity. Not with violence, but with discernment. Not with fear, but with the steady, deliberate, moral courage to think. There is one final truth that must be said, and it is perhaps the most difficult of all. The great threat in the rise of stupid power is not merely that people stop thinking. It is that those who still can think choose not to speak. I have seen this many times. The scholar who remains quiet in fear of losing status. The preacher who avoids truth to maintain harmony. The neighbor who shrugs off lies because they do not affect him directly. They are not evil men, but in their silence, they become useful to evil. You see, when stupidity gains power, it does not rise alone. It rises with the quiet permission of the thoughtful, those who whisper in private but fall silent in public. Those who say, "It is not my place," while truth dies in the streets. Those who believe that their personal integrity can be preserved without ever risking it. But silence, in times like these, is not neutral. It is a decision. And decisions shape history. The death of reason is not only the fault of those who scream falsehoods, it is also the fault of those who know better and do nothing. Why is this silence so dangerous? Because stupidity feeds on it. Stupidity thrives in echo chambers, in spaces where no one dares to ask a difficult question. It grows strong when dissent is punished and conformity is rewarded. And when the wise grow quiet, the unthinking feel bold. They fill the airwaves, the pulpits, the parliaments. They become the voices of a generation, not because they are right, but because the right voices fell silent. Let us not forget it is possible for a society to become so afraid of discomfort that it sacrifices truth for peace. But that peace will not last. It is built on sand. In every age of rising tyranny or spiritual decay, the question has been the same: will those who know the truth speak, or will they fall silent until it is too late? Courage is not always loud. Often, it is the quiet voice that says, "This is wrong," or the firm refusal to repeat what is false, or the solitary stand when others bow. And yes, it costs something. To speak against stupidity is to invite mockery. To expose lies is to become a threat. To question loudly accepted foolishness is to risk your reputation, your relationships, even your safety. But I tell you this: the cost of silence is greater. You may keep your comfort, your career, your circle of friends, but you will lose something far more precious: your integrity, your witness, your humanity. For we are not merely minds. We are moral beings. And our silence either shelters truth or shelters evil. So I leave you with this: when stupidity becomes power, and power rewards stupidity, the world is not saved by shouting. It is saved by the few who refuse to surrender thought, and even more, by those who speak. Not because it is safe, but because it is right. Be among them. Do not wait for the world to applaud you. You will stand alone before you stand with others. But in doing so, you will preserve something the world cannot afford to losing: the sacred union between truth and the human spirit. Let it not be said that you were wise, and yet remained silent. The rise of stupid power is not a story of others. It is a mirror. It reflects back the question, not of whether the world is falling apart, but whether we are still awake within it. This moment, this age, demands something raring: not more information, not more outrage, but more conscience. It demands that we reclaim our capacity to think, to speak, and to stand, even when the world around us has surrendered all three. You will be told that truth is relative, that your silence is maturity, that comfort is the highest good. But I tell you, when reason dies, so does freedom. And only those who resist quietly, faithfully, and relentlessly, first within, then without, will light the path forward. Do not be afraid of being alone. Be afraid of becoming unthinking. Do not seek to be accepted. Seek instead to be true. And if you must speak, speak not to be heard, but to break the silence that stupidity demands. That alone is resistance. That alone is human. That alone is the beginning of hope.